to the Ballard District Council meeting. My name is Tom Friedman. I'm president of the District Council this year. First of all, I want to thank the Nordic Museum, especially Eric Peel in the back, who offered to let us have the meeting in this facility tonight. It's a beautiful place, and if you haven't been in the museum, I certainly encourage you to do so. First thing on our agenda tonight is we usually go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves and maybe say where they're from, if you're from an organization or a specific neighborhood. But we're going to have to limit you to just a few seconds tonight so we can get through, and then we'll get into Councilmember O'Brien. He's going to talk first about ADUs, DADUs, and mandatory housing affordability, and then we'll have some questions on that, and then we'll open up the floor to other questions. If you haven't signed up to ask a question yet, please do so on the list in the back of the room at the table, because we're going to start off by going down that list. All right, I'm going to start off with introductions. Let's start off with this gentleman over here. Yes?
Sean Telford. I live in the Freelard area. I operate a couple of Airbnbs over there, so just kind of really representing myself and my business interests in James.
My name is Kate Barton. I'm a candidate for City Council in this district.
I'm Richard Fuhr, and I'm from the Bryant neighborhood, so northeast Seattle.
Don Benson, I'm a Ballard resident, I'm also on the Ballard District Council executive position. Sam Starr, I live near the former Heritage Museum site.
Chris Hennessy, you live up on Finney?
Lisa Griswold, I'm in District 6.
Larry Arceta, I'm in Valley.
I'm Jay Sassy, and I live in Buchanan, and think about moving about it, and heard it's kind of fun.
I'm Julie Paul, District 6. I'm here to report back to my senior neighbors that can't make it tonight. Erica Nagy, Ballard resident, part of Speak Out Seattle.
Mike Carr, President, Central Ballard Residents Association. As you can guess, I'm a resident of Ballard. Central is that.
Jessica Dixon, I'm the Big Ridge Community Council, and I work with Ballard.
Alice Posey, president of Finney Ridge Community Council.
Jenny Hines, president of Sustainable Ballard. I live in Ballard.
Hugh Geenan.
I'm Chris Norwich, well-known sales council block driver. I live in Central Ballard.
Sarah Longley, I'm a Ballard resident and business owner.
Matthew Lang, I'm the lead organizer of the Transit Riding Union, and I work with the Ballard Community Task Force on homelessness. Also Ballard resident.
Katie Victor, Ballard resident.
Hey, Coley, I live on Sunset Boulevard.
Generally Fox, I recently started going to the task force meetings as well.
Beverly Carls, and Magnolia. Sam Rothman, Ballard resident.
Elizabeth is interested. Maureen Brinkland, Sunset Hill resident, former president of Sunset Hill Community Association, and currently working with the Ballard Community Task Force on homelessness and hunger.
Chief Darcy, Ballard Community Task Force on Homelessness and Hunger.
Brian Hodnick, I'm resident of Roosevelt for last year, but 25 years before that was all Ballard, on property over here.
Blue Northwest, Old Ballard resident. Zach, Ballard resident.
Ian O'Connor, Ballard resident.
Miles Black, Ballard resident.
Bennett Barr, I live in Whittier Heights.
Bill Daniel, Ballard resident, Sunset Hill.
Mark Taylor, Ballard resident.
Eric Peel, as Tom mentioned, I work here at the Nordic Museum and I live in Fremont.
Ross Reynolds, KUOW. We have a unit at our station that answers your questions, and we've got some postcards up in front. We've got extras here if you'd like to have a question answered by our reporting staff.
also on the
Michael Soriano, I'm the noble grand elect of the Oddfellows in Ballard.
Mike Kelly, a longtime Ballard.
Dave O'Hearn, I live on a sailboat at Shilshole Marina, just representing myself today.
Sean Klein, second Ballard resident.
Rita Burke, Ballard resident.
Andy Bover, Ballard resident.
Glenn Bolin, D6 resident, working on getting a job in either Fremont or Ballard.
Andrew Holden, Ballard resident.
Dick Water, small business owner in Ballard, live in Ballard.
Kathleen Waller, small business owner in Valley.
Eric, Vinnie Ridge. Jim Street, Capitol Hill resident.
Kathleen Gross, downtown Ballard resident and business owner.
Harry Tremblay, 1-year Ballard resident.
Mike Edinger, Ballard resident.
Sally Kenny, Lake City resident, I'm concerned about homelessness.
Jim Harris, I also live on Old Churchill Bakery, where I'm representing myself.
Lori Miller, I'm the moderator of my Ballard group on Facebook and a resident.
I'm Megan Walker, and the editor of Ballard.
I'm Jane Kotzenberger from the Baker Street Community Group, and I am so proud to see all of my Ballard peeps showing up tonight. Thank you.
Want to go out here?
Well, let's get each of you guys.
Okay. I'm Brent Lackey. I'm the president of the Whittier Heights Community Council and the vice president right now of Ballard District Council.
Mike O'Brien, city council member. Hi, everybody. Joe.
Joe Worth, Seattle, Ballard, and Olympic Manor resident.
I'm Pete.
I live about 6 blocks away.
I'm Angie, and public school parent, small landlord, and just started serving on the board of Ballard District Council.
Is that everybody? John?
John Mitchell, I'm Ballard Council, representing the Ballard Rotary Club.
And Remington Bilo, Vinnie Ridge resident, and Vinnie Ridge Community Council member.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming. One more? Okay.
One more, right here.
Again, if you want to ask a question tonight, we're going to start off by using the sign-up list that was in the back of the room when you came in. So if you haven't signed up and you want to ask a question, please do that. Okay, our guest tonight is Councilmember Mike O'Brien, District 6 Council member, and he's going to start off by talking about accessory dwelling units and the HALA proposals that are being kicked around. Then we'll have some questions on those two topics, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor, again using the list when you signed in. And if we have time after that, we'll have other people can ask questions. I'm going to try to make sure we cover a variety of topics, so if you have a question that somebody else has already covered, even if it's not specific, but if it's generally on the topic, I might cut you off and move on to the next question. Okay, Mike.
Hello, everyone. So thank you all for being here tonight. Tom, thank you and the Ballard District Council for inviting me, and thanks to the Nordic Museum for hosting us. Lovely facility. My plan tonight, as Tom said, I'm going to try to keep it to about 10 minutes to give an overview of the backyard cottage legislation and in-law unit legislation that just cleared through the, we just finished the environmental impact statement. The adequacy of that is being challenged. So I'll walk through the timing on that and some of the policy decisions that are before us. That'll be one of the big policy decisions we'll be making in the first half of next year. And the other one I was asked to speak a little bit about is the mandatory housing affordability. So I'll try to cover those in kind of broad strokes in about 10 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to questions for the rest of the time. And I'm happy to answer questions on those topics or any other topics. So first I'm going to start with the backyard cottage legislation. A little bit of history here. Well, going back to 1994, the city made it legal just about in any single family zone for folks to build in-law units, so basement units within the existing structure. So that's been in place for over 20 years. 2006, new legislation made it possible for folks to build a backyard cottage throughout the city in most lots in single-family zones. A couple of years ago, we started looking at that as the housing crisis was increasing, as we were hearing from more and more people who were homeowners trying to figure out how to work within the existing code to build one of those units and having some challenges. And we went out and did a bit of a roadshow. We had a meeting in South Seattle, meeting in North Seattle, probably over 100 folks at each of those, to get feedback from folks about how the legislation was working for them, what they were interested in doing. Based on those two community meetings, we drafted some legislation, started in the legislative process, and got challenged by the Queen Anne Community Council over a question of whether that legislation was required to go through full environmental review. The city lost, Queen Anne Community Council won, and so we were required to do an environmental impact statement on that legislation. That process took about 2 years. That process was completed a couple months ago, so we released the final environmental impact statement with a preferred alternative. There's a 3-week appeal period for that. The Queen Anne Community Council appealed the adequacy of the environmental impact statement. That hearing is scheduled for the end of March. And so it'll probably be a week-long hearing. It'll probably take 2 to 4 weeks after that hearing for the hearing examiner to issue a ruling. If the hearing examiner rules that the environmental impact statement met the state law for studying the impacts of the legislation, then the city council at that point will be free to act upon legislation. And so what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is under the assumption that we win that challenge and we go forward on that timing. There were 4 major changes in the backyard cottage and mother-in-law legislation that was proposed about 2 years ago. And the preferred alternative that came out of the environmental impact statement shifted a little bit from that. And so I'll talk a little bit about the base and where that is. I'll just say I have 3 handouts related to backyard cottages. I only made about 30 copies of each, so I didn't put them out for everybody, but if folks are interested, there's one that talks about, well, there's 3 of them, you can look at them. One of them compares the legislation from 2 years ago, the legislation, or the preferred alternative in the EIS, and what current legislation is. But I'll touch on those really quickly. So one of the current law requires that if you're going to build an accessory unit, so either an in-law unit or a backyard cottage, you have to provide an off-street parking spot for that unit. Additionally, if the existing home doesn't have an off-street parking spot, you'd have to provide 2 spots, so one for the existing home and one for the accessory dwelling. That has been a challenge. The proposed legislation 2 years ago and the preferred alternative would eliminate that requirement. Another challenge that we heard was around height and size. Currently, a backyard cottage is limited to 800 square feet. And the height limits vary depending on the width of the lot from, I think, 12 to 14 feet tall. The proposed legislation from 2 years ago is generally consistent with the preferred alternative, which allows for those units to be about 1,000 square feet and allows them to be 1 to 2 feet taller across the board. Again, I think there's 3 or 4 categories depending on the width of the lot. Another requirement, the law says that if you are renting out an accessory dwelling unit, whether it's in the basement or in the backyard, the owner of the property has to be living on site. So there's an owner occupancy requirement. The proposed legislation from 2 years ago I proposed to shift that to a 1-year requirement. So the owner, if you wanted to build an accessory unit, you would have to stay on site for 1 year, but then if you chose to move somewhere else or forced to, you could rent out both those units. The information that we gathered in the environmental impact statement, well, let me back up a bit. The concerns that folks have were kind of in 2 categories around the owner occupancy requirement. One category was around, I would rather have owners in my neighborhood than renters in my neighborhood, and so let's require that. The other category was around, I feel much more comfortable with the owner of the property building this as opposed to speculative developers building it. I understand the concern folks have about renters. I don't actually agree with that, so I think renters and homeowners are both good neighbors, and so discriminating against folks who rent is not something I'm interested in doing. I was concerned about folks concerned about speculative development in the single-family zones, about building more of these. What we studied in the EIS was what are the economic viability of that. And what we saw generally was it's unlikely that it's viable in today's market for folks to tear down houses and build backyard cottages and then rent them out on a developer scale. What we're proposing now is in the preferred alternative is that there's an ownership requirement, different than an owner occupancy requirement. You have to have owned the property for more than a year. And this gets to another change. If you're going to do both an in-law unit and a backyard cottage. So if you're a landlord right now, you own a single family home and you're renting it out, and you've owned the house for more than a year, and you would like to build both a backyard cottage and an in-law unit, you could do that right now. But if you're someone coming in buying that new, you'd have to maintain your ownership for over a year before you could do that. Another change that I didn't mention is current law allows you to do either a mother basement unit or a backyard unit, but not both. The proposal, both 2 years ago and in the preferred alternative, is that you could do both of those. We're not changing any of the lot coverage requirements. You're only allowed to cover, I think, 40% of the lot in the single-family zone. Setback requirements, other things like that generally stay the same. And so that's the gist of it. There's one other change that's in the preferred alternative, which is kind of a new concept. And this is a limit on the floor area ratio that you can build in the single-family zone. Essentially, this limits the size of a house that folks can build in single-family zoning. Briefly, the concept of floor area ratio is if you're on a 5,000 square foot lot, which in theory is a typical lot in Seattle, a 1 FAR, so 1 floor area ratio, means you can build 1 square foot of floor area for every square foot of lot size. So on a 5,000 square foot lot, you could build a 5,000 square foot home. The proposal is that to limit single-family zone housing to half an FAR. So on a 5,000 square foot lot, you would be limited to building a 2,500 square foot home. The reason we're doing this is about the speculative nature and what's happening. And what we do see is that there is a market for people to tear down older homes in single-family zones. And when they do that, we all know that housing is very expensive and land's really expensive in Seattle. How they maximize their profit is they build McMansions or mini mansions or whatever you want to call them. And what I've heard from a lot of folks is that that's not what we want to see happening in our neighborhoods. What that tends to do is make neighborhoods less affordable. And what we prefer to do is say, keep the existing house. If you want to touch it up a bit and remodel it, that's great. But instead, if you want to add value, why don't you build an accessory unit in the basement or a backyard cottage? And that adds 2 housing units that will almost certainly be less expensive than the 1 big housing unit. So this is a new concept that the public hasn't talked about. It's relatively new to me, my colleagues. And so what we plan to do in the new year, again, we have to wait through about March until we're through the hearing at the hearing examiner. But we're going to start having discussions probably in February, kind of briefings about what this FAR would mean, because we want to make sure we understand it. There isn't actually legislation written about this. It's the concept is in the environmental impact statement. We have to draft the specifics around legislation. And we want to hear from homeowners and others in the community about what this might mean to their community. We believe about 11% of housing in single-family zone is in excess of a half FAR. So those would be non-conforming uses. So we want to understand what that would mean. We want to explain to all the folks out there what that would mean. And undoubtedly we will tweak this as we go forward, and we'll see where it ends up. But we'll start that process likely in February. And we'll also have more conversations about how we would craft the specifics around the ownership requirement if you're going to build 2 units. Then in probably the end of March or in April, when we're through the hearing examiner process, assuming we get the green light, we will start the legislative process. We'll have a number of committee meetings, likely public hearing, and then hopefully by the end of the first half of the year have a chance to vote on legislation. So plenty of opportunity for folks to weigh in on that, to hear opinions. I imagine we'll get some questions on that later today. I want to pivot now to talk about MHA, also about the process on that. I'm going to do a little less background on that because I think most folks know about what that means. But general concept with the mandatory housing affordability is an inclusionary housing requirement, and it will require essentially all new development in the city to pay or provide affordable housing. This is both commercial development and residential development. The challenge we have in Washington state law, as opposed to some other states, is that we cannot, there's not a clear path for us to legally require developers to provide affordable housing. But there is a path that we've crafted that says, if we give you additional zoning capacity, in exchange for that zoning capacity, we can impose a requirement on affordable housing. And so part of what we're doing in this mandatory housing affordability is making zoning changes throughout the city. Now, we've done this already and passed it in downtown and South Lake Union, University District, a couple smaller nodes, Chinatown International District around the city. But the vast majority of our neighborhoods have not had those zoning changes yet. And the proposal is to move forward with that. That was challenged by a number of neighborhood groups and a number of organizations. It was about a 6-month process coming through the hearing examiner. The hearing examiner ultimately ruled that with a few exceptions, the city is allowed to proceed on that. Essentially that the environmental impact statement was adequate. They did require the city to go back and do a little more work around historical resources in the city, and so that work is currently being done. I'm not sure exactly how long that will take, but I expect that sometime in January that work will start to be incorporated into the legislation and into an addendum, I believe, to the environmental impact statement. And then we will, concurrent to that, we're going to proceed with committee meetings around mandatory housing affordability. So this will make zoning changes essentially to all the urban villages in the city of Seattle that haven't had a zoning change in the last couple of years, which is the vast majority other than the ones I already mentioned. For folks that are involved, there's been a number of community meetings. I know I recognize some faces here who have been to those community meetings. We talked about those. What's going to happen over the next couple months is the specifics around where are the lines around the urban village. Is, along 15th Street going to be neighborhood commercial 50 feet high? Is it going to be neighborhood commercial 40 feet high? Is it going to be neighborhood commercial 65 feet high? A block off 15th, will that be low-rise 1, low-rise 2? Will it be residential small lot? So all those decisions, we studied a range of options, but we're going to start to be having some pretty serious council meetings to discuss the specifics around that. So in some of the areas, I've been working with a lot of folks in Crown Hill, specifically around the zoning up there. There's a desire to concentrate some of the density on 15th and have a more gradual transition into the current single-family zones. Maybe have more of the existing single-family convert to residential small lot as opposed to a low-rise zone. So those are the types of conversations that MAPS will be looking at. There's a handout up here that has a rough timeline of what that looks like. Essentially, for the month of January, we're going to be having meetings where we go over a series of amendments that we might propose to the maps that are already out there in the environmental impact statement. It's expected that in the months of February and March, we will be voting on those to finalize the layouts in different neighborhoods. With hopefully, at least Councilmember Johnson, who will be running the series committee, his current schedule shows that by the end of March, we would pass that out. There's a lot of people that think that's kind of ambitious and may roll over into April, but that's the current timeline of that. So, with that, I'm a little out of breath. Why don't we stop and go to questions, and Tom, you can decide which questions we're going to do first.
Okay, we had quite a few people signing up, but we're going to start off with questions on the housing affordability and the DADUs, ADUs, the ADUs, and first off, we've got Glenn.
We can't hear you.
Sorry.
Can you also, there's a few extra seats still, and we have more people arriving. Can you just take a moment for people to search out a chair?
Sure, if you want to find a seat, there's a few empty chairs around. If you've got a chair next to you, maybe raise your hand.
Can I ask you a question about what was just said?
Did you sign up?
I did, but I didn't understand something.
All right, well, I'll try to come back to you. Thanks. All right, first is Glenn Buellman. Glenn?
Hi, thank you for coming and speaking to us. I guess, first I just want to say with everything I'm seeing and hearing that the discussions that have been going on, I'm kind of excited. It looks like Seattle is on the verge of possibly becoming a much more welcoming city for everybody across all of our neighborhoods, which I'm happy to see. My question is, and I don't know if I really expect you to answer it, but given that single-family zoning was created to segregate neighborhoods, I just don't understand how council can consider maintaining it? Like, how can council justify that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. So, I'm going to answer that in a couple different ways. One is to start off with, the name single-family zone is probably misleading and has been for decades, at least going back to 1994 when every part of this, essentially every lot in the city in single-family zoning could build a mother or a basement unit, which would imply two families. I guess in theory it could be one family, but the idea that the single-family zoning is prohibited to a single family living on a property has not been true for a long time. And it's probably worth considering whether that misleading name should be changed. That would actually change any real policies, but seem we may be able to match up a little better. I agree with you, absolutely. There's, I think the evidence is undisputable that going back almost a century, in this country, we used zoning laws to racially segregate people in our communities. And it's an awful thing. In the city of Seattle, we have redlining, we have the maps, we show them all the time about the neighborhoods, and it wouldn't surprise people where communities of color live today is where we regulated that only community colors could own housing a long time ago. That doesn't mean that people that own single-family homes today are racists. I want to be clear. These policies we inherited from our forefathers. And I know people have they really value the single-family, the neighborhoods they live in. I think we need to constantly be reevaluating who we are as a city. And when you look at our history and what's happened, and if you reject that idea that we should be segregated as a community, and you realize that the only people that can live in your community are people that can afford $1 million home, and who makes $1 million today in our society, and it tends to be people that from a certain class and a certain skin color, it starts to have those similar effects. And if we want to break that down, we want to think about how to do that. Now, I personally am not supportive of going to, I don't really know how this works in Houston, but they kind of have no zoning laws and you kind of do whatever you want everywhere. I think zoning laws serve some pretty awful features, but they also serve some meaningful features. And so how do we evolve as a community to be more inclusive, to allow people from a variety of backgrounds to live in our neighborhoods and from a variety of different income levels? How do we create different housing types that are affordable? And respect that, there are things that we like about our neighborhoods that we may not want to give up. I mentioned earlier, some people feel like, hey, I want homeowners in my neighborhood, not renters. I personally disagree with that. I find that kind of offensive. But I think folks would say, look, I think I like more setbacks and I want more trees and things like that. Let's talk about what that looks like and how we can strike a balance. We live in a democracy. And you have 9 city council members and a mayor who's setting policy right now. But we are picked by all of you. And a change to the single-family zoning is something that's going to happen over decades. We can make steps today, but it's ultimately going to reflect where the public will is. And when the majority of people are demanding that we radically change single-family zones, you will elect people that will radically do that. And when a majority of people are resisting, you will see much slower progress. And I think that's part of, that's what a democracy looks like. And I encourage folks who want to see those changes to be doing organizing and having conversations and figuring out what that middle ground is. Now, the legislation around backyard cottages and in-law units, basement units, does allow for additional flexibility in zones. It's not as far as what Minneapolis just did. They didn't actually pass the legislation, but they updated the comprehensive plan that essentially said triplexes are okay in the single-family zones. Triplexes are pretty distinct from a backyard cottage and an in-law unit, but the legislation we're talking about, instead of allowing 2 units on a single-family zone as today, would allow 3 potentially, if you meet those requirements. So it's a step, and I think it's a conversation that we all need to be having on an ongoing basis about what inclusivity looks like.
Next on that same area, mandatory housing, is Mike Cars. Mike, is your question different?
Oh, yeah, very much so.
All right, we'll find out.
I probably don't even need a microphone. Okay.
Okay. We were one of the 28 or 29 groups that filed the challenge to the...
Hang on a second. I am going to try to limit questions to be brief and not start off with not that you're going to do that, but please don't give a big intro, ask your questions so we can try to get this thing moving.
I understand that. Try to do a very short preface. So anyway, we're one of the many neighborhood groups who felt we were not part of the grand bargain. And the question that I have, a couple things. First, have you read the final decision from the hearing examiner?
I have not read the whole thing cover to cover. I've read the highlighted sections.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a specific question regarding the fees. Now, the way that it was proposed is that developers would either provide housing in their particular building or pay a percentage of money to the city to build housing elsewhere. One of the problems that we saw with that kind of concept is that builders could come into a neighborhood, buy all the buildings, pay a very small percentage fee to the city, and force everybody who was living there in the housing that was affordable to move elsewhere and away from the neighborhoods that they were there for many years. Comment, please.
Yeah, I mean, that's what developers are doing without the law right now. We don't have the types of renter protections and rent control and eviction protections that some other jurisdictions have. And so there's an absolute outright right, if you're a property owner or you want to become a property owner, to decide what you can do. I mean, we do have some tenant protections for low-income housing and some relocation assistance. But if someone comes in and buys a building, our state law is pretty clear on the property rights that you have a lot of authority to do whatever you want with it. And I think a lot of the displacement we're seeing in the city is because of that. Now, what we're proposing to do under mandatory housing affordability is require 5 to 7% of the new housing that's built to be affordable. And that's 5 to 7% more than we're getting today. Should it be 25? Would I like to see 25? Absolutely, I would. Again, state law requires that we give zoning changes commensurate with that. And so instead of going up a floor, we go up 6 floors to get a 25% set aside for affordable housing. And I don't think the community is prepared for that, but those are things that we can decide going forward. I think the concern you raised about the displacement and having, Mike, I absolutely share with you. But I would point back and say, that is what's happening under our current law. And I don't get to change the state laws. We have people, housing advocates for years, that have been down in Olympia trying to change to allow cities like Seattle to do mandatory inclusionary housing without the zoning changes, but we have been unable to get those changes in Olympia year after year after year. And so we're trying to figure out what we can do. I want to mention one other thing too, because you made reference to the grand bargain process. And I want to just acknowledge that that was a closed-door, private meeting that is not okay to me. That was Mayor Murray's setup, and he is a mayor, and he gets to choose who he wants to bring into rooms and how that happens. About the same time that was happening, I started a process. I was chair of the land use committee and was doing a process around micro-housing units, apartments and those types. And I chose to say, this is open, the public can come, the press can come, anyone can watch. Limited public comment and how much back and forth with, but I wanted to say this has to be transparent because that's how I believe processes should run. At the end of the day, we'll continue to not always agree on what we come out with, but I don't agree with how Mayor Murray ran that process. And the lack of transparency, I think, is a problem.
And do you know how the upcoming process is going to be run?
Upcoming process from this mayor? I have to ask her.
All right, we have one more person who signed up for ADUs, Jay Katzenberger.
Thanks. Mike, you know that I have supported you on many things, and we've disagreed on a few things. And this is one of those places where I think it's somewhat disingenuous to say that the City Council right now developers can do what they want and you have very little recourse. I think in this legislation, and what I'm asking for is that you look very closely before you give away the farm. And by giving away the farm in a grand bargain type way, is the City Council has a very powerful tool, and that's the environmental impact statement. What is being proposed under HALA is a very broad blanket EIS instead of a neighborhood by neighborhood EIS, which means that under HALA, you have one environmental impact statement that covers all of these communities, instead of looking at the specific impact of, say, development that is being proposed on 24th Avenue Northwest, which is going to have an impact on the combined sewer overflow at the end of 24th. So unless you're looking neighborhood by neighborhood and how it's going to impact transportation, pedestrian safety, school safety, sewage, drainage, all of those things, and you have the power to do that with an environmental impact statement, I'm asking, don't give away the farm in another grand bargain and hold on to something that city has as leverage to work with developers with affordable housing.
So, Jenna, thanks for those comments. You know, we could choose what legislation to do. We could choose to do multiple environmental impact statements on all this. That's absolutely true. My comment was, if we don't do that and don't change it, the existing code allows developers to develop today. It's not like, you know, if you look around, it's not like no development is happening because we haven't done MHA. So the displacement is happening, the development is happening regardless of us passing MHA, right?
But you can require an environmental impact statement to inform the zoning, which you have not done.
So we can choose to do environmental impact statements as we make policy at the city. There are certain types of land use changes where we're required to do that. Obviously, there's areas where we disagree, and sometimes, like as mentioned on the backyard cottages, we didn't think we needed to, but the hearing examiner said we did. And of course, we can always choose to do that. It's a very expensive process. Could take, you know, if we were going to do it for 36 neighborhoods, and the missed opportunity on the development that's already happening right now, and we're not getting affordable housing for me, is a problem. I don't want to wait another decade to require developers to provide affordable housing. But I will say that we have looked at the things you talked about. You know, so for instance, often when properties get redeveloped, because the current code about stormwater treatment is so much better than when the existing houses were built, and I've had this conversation multiple times with Seattle Public Utilities, they say, yeah, getting rid of that one house and putting 4 units there, we're better off from a stormwater because the stormwater requirement and what they're required to treat on site is actually better than the existing one. So we do look at...
That's incorrect, sir. That's incorrect because...
Well, that's what SPU told me, so...
Well, that's what SPU told you, but...
I don't think we're going to get into back and forth here, Jen, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards.
I understand, but what I'm saying is, you're saying that's what SPU told you. What I'm asking for, and I'm asking respectfully, is don't give up on that power of an EIS to protect neighborhoods like Ballard and Finney Ridge and our environment, our transportation.
You talk about the power to...
neighborhood by neighborhood basis,
So
order to make that
say
zone
don't
happen.
pass, for the council not to pass any zoning changes without doing an EIS. Is that what you're asking?
Neighborhood by neighborhood EIS,
So,
yes.
so we did a big one that covered all the neighborhoods.
Poorly.
Understood. That's not what the hearing examiner said, but like,
No,
something
actually,
said.
yeah, but the standard is so low, the city made it.
He did say that the standard was very low. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, I think we're going to move on. Thanks for the question, thanks for the answer.
Thank you for your question.
Mike, you said you might be available to talk about that a little more after, perhaps. Thanks. All right, we're going to move on now to another topic. Brian Plotnick? Brian?
Yeah, I want to ask about homeless service provider accountability. When I look at the Pathways Home timeline, which is the 2016 person-centered approach, I think a lot of people know what that is, way behind on enforcing actual homeless service provider accountability, way behind. And finally, when it was done last quarter, it was just like a 3% monies like taken away from the ones that failed, which is not even a slap on the wrist. So I guess my question really is how, when is City Council going to actually hold these service providers accountable and show us that, and in a real way, not just a 3% fine, because the way I see you guys still dishing out money to organizations like Share, that obviously we don't know where that money goes, and neither do they, and they even run out of it, and nobody knows where it went, tells me that the city council isn't really adhering to Pathways Homes, which used to be a link on the Seattle.gov to a pointer to all those documents that shows what the plan's supposed to be, which I still have pointers to, but the city removed the main page. So I guess anyone wants to see that, let me know, I'll point you to it. But that's my question is, when are you gonna really enforce this in a real way, and how will we know?
So the homeless service contracts that we let a year ago, so this time last year, were the ones that had the requirement that the providers transition people into housing, and if they failed to do so, there was a penalty imposed. And well, to you, the 3% is pretty modest. To these homeless service providers, it's devastating. These are not well-funded organizations. They pay close to poverty wages to try to maintain the services that they can for as many people, and they see that every day they're turning away people that is really hard on them, so they're trying to do their best. But we did move in that direction to provide accountability. And so it's part of all the contracts now. And so, if you want a 5% or 10% or 25% penalty for not meeting that, I'm not prepared to go there right now, and I'll tell you why. The Downtown Emergency Service Center is an example I'll use. They run a shelter a couple blocks from Seattle City Hall. They have a couple hundred folks in there in various configurations on any given night. They turn away people every night. Some of the hardest to house are there. And then they're expected to get those people into housing. That is a good expectation. They should be setting them up to make sure that they are on lists and know where to go. But I can tell you that housing is full. We don't have empty beds on any given night. The idea that the reason the homeless service providers are failing is because we have a bunch of affordable housing in the city that's sitting empty and they haven't bothered to go connect people with it is false. Those places are full. So I can pit DESC against Plymouth Housing and have them fight over which of their constituents gets into that one bed that opens tonight, and the winner gets to keep their 3% and the other one gets penalized. But I don't really want to pit them against each other. And so we've set up a system called, I'm blank on it, but we have a referral service where all the providers put their names in a list. People are scored on 16 criteria, and the ones in most need of housing, depending on the housing that's available, get assigned to housing. DESC actually runs housing, in addition to shelters. So they run permanent supportive housing. They probably have over, they were one of the first people in the country that did housing first housing or permanent supportive housing at 1811 East Lake. It was over a decade ago. It's expensive housing, but it's cheaper than not providing it because the people they're serving spend nights in emergency rooms and jails, which costs us a lot of money. And it's been a very effective tool. It often gets pointed to as, why doesn't Seattle do permanent supportive housing? We now have over 2,000 units of permanent supportive housing. As I said, DESC is a major provider of that. They are now allowed to refer their client into their housing because they have to put their clients into the list at the county to see who deserves it. And so yes, absolutely, all these service providers should be working with the clients to get them on the appropriate lists and advocating for them to get into housing. But if we want to have, it's called coordinated entry, I just remembered it. If we want to go through coordinated entry system-wide as opposed to individual housing providers cherry-picking who they want in their housing, we've taken power away from these shelters to actually get them into housing. And now we're requiring them to provide housing when the housing doesn't exist. So, yes, we should hold them accountable. Yes, everyone can always do a better job, and we expect them to do a better job, especially right now. I don't think it's fair to be unrealistic about what they can achieve. And I also think it's unfair to expect some of the lowest paid people in our community, who have some of the hardest jobs in our community, to try to solve a problem that's so complex that we haven't figured out how to solve it. We're setting ourselves up to fail. And so, in this budget, we did some things, we provided 2% raises, or funding to the homeless service providers could give 2% raises to all their providers. And they were very grateful for that. But we know that 2% raises doesn't even keep up with inflation, let alone fix the underpayment that they're having. We're seeing, 50% turnover a year, folks. They're talking about they can't fill the empty spots, and then they're expected to be accountable to some, high-level standards. We hear from businesses in town, that's not how I would run my business. Like, well, you wouldn't pay employees that little either, and expect so much out of them. So it's a fair question, and we absolutely need to figure out how we do a better job with the resources we have, and everyone, including DSC, Plymouth Housing, can always do a better job. But we got to be fair to them too, and we got to provide them the resources to be successful.
Okay, we got a couple more questions, or people who want to talk about homeless. Might not get to all of you, but Jean, Darcy, you're next.
Mike, we have a record number of people living on the streets. We also have a record number of people dying on the streets. How does any of these changes that you've been talking about going to affect that? Most of these people either have no income or very little income. A lot of people are on disability, a few $100s a month. How is any of this going to make a difference to them?
It's a hard question for me to answer, Gene. I'll start by telling you some of the things we are doing, some of the work that I'm proud of. We continue to increase the amount of affordable housing we're building because I think at the heart of it, that's where we need to be putting our resources. Things like mandatory housing affordability, it's not really seeing the effects of that, but we've done a lot of work around the previous iteration of something called incentive zoning. Plus aggressive work, support from the public on the housing levy, aggressive work to figure out how, when we do sell properties, we can get more money into affordable housing. Last year, we opened about 250 units of affordable housing through the city Office of Housing programs. This year, we expect to hit about 350 units. Next year, we expect to open almost 900 units of affordable housing. The awards are going to be announced, I think, later this week or next week on the latest round of investments we're making. And I haven't seen those awards yet, but I know that we were able to make a significant investment. And that's probably housing that's going to show up 2 to 3 years from now. But I'm hoping that we'll see 750 to 1,000 units as the new baseline going forward. We've made significant increases in affordable housing investments. We've also continued to expand our shelter options, and we've converted our existing shelter system to a better shelter system. Specifically, the open up at 10 at night, kick you out at 6 in the morning, sleep on a mat and a floor. A lot of folks would rather sleep under a tree somewhere where they can don't have to be subject to that set of rules. We're converting a lot of the shelters to 24-hour shelters, have storage units, those types of things. And so we have more and better shelter units. We're also doing a better job, to Brian, your question about how are we transitioning. In the first half of this year, we transitioned over 2,500 households out of homelessness into permanent housing. So 38% increase over the same period the previous year, which was an increase over the previous year. So, if I was just showing you those slides, Gene, I would have a smile on my face, because we have more housing, we have more shelter, we're doing a better job getting people into housing. Unfortunately, we also have more people living outdoors, we have more people dying. And there is something broken in our system that despite doing better work at the local level, there are more and more people enduring homelessness every year. And every year we do a better job adding another unit here and another shelter there. And it turns out we needed 3 more units and 3 more shelters. And we haven't been able to keep up with that demand. So we continue to increase our investments to try to keep up with it. But if we do not seriously attack the root causes of this, I fear that year after year you will be inviting me to stand out with the women in black at a new record-breaking year where more people died outside than the previous year. And I don't want that to be real. So what do we have to do to attack the root causes? These root causes, for the most part, are a lot bigger than any single city. There's an opiate epidemic that we all know about. We need some serious attention to that. We put an extra $1 million in the budget for Evergreen Health Treatment Services. They're treating 1,700 people on a daily basis for various forms of addiction, and they have a sign on their front door that says walk-ins cannot be handled. We're at capacity right now. So hopefully with that money we put in, we'll be able to add a few more nurses and a few more case managers or counselors to increase the capacity. But $1 million over the next 2 years is not going to drastically change that. We need federal help and federal support. We need policies that are designed to not get people addicted in the first place, and for the thousands or millions of people that are addicted, that we have the wraparound services to get them out. Because it is expensive and time-consuming. It's going to take a long time to fix that. We have rapidly rising housing costs in the city. We don't have tools like rent control. Rent control's controversial. I don't want to pretend that I know how rent control, if we had the tools, how we would use it and how it would work. But we don't have anything we can do about that. And so what we see is when we have 10% rent increases year after year after year, people that used to consider themselves middle class are facing homelessness. Now, we have built a lot of housing, the market rate housing for sure, in the last 4 or 5 years. And what we've seen is the rents have slowed way down and housing costs have stabilized. So, you know, building a lot of supply will ultimately help, but we're a popular city and a lot of people want to live here, and that continues to happen. We have an economy that is inequitable. I mean, every year, for whatever reason, we see fewer and fewer people control more and more wealth, and more people are falling from the middle class into the lower classes and facing poverty. You know, that is a structural problem with our economy that has to do with the federal tax system and other things that we need to shift if we want to stop people entering homelessness. Mental health is the last one I'll let you mention. You know, Washington State scores really poorly. We're one of the worst as far as investments per capita in mental health. We need the type of mental health treatment so that people can be stabilized in housing, and then healthcare in general needs to be available for everyone. So, I don't have a great answer for you, Gene. I think that the city's doing a lot of the things that we can do that's in our control, and I think we're doing a better job every year on getting better results out of that, and we continue to be overwhelmed.
Thanks. Okay, we're going to move on to another topic if we have time at the end, and there's some more questions about the homeless issue. We can get to those. Next we have Jessica Dixon. Where are you, Jessica?
Great. Hi. As you are aware, our mature urban trees, our native trees, do some heavy lifting when it comes to carbon sequestration, stormwater mitigation, and filtering polluted air. Without adequate protections, these trees are in danger of being cut down as our neighborhoods are upzoned. Will you commit to passing a stronger tree protection ordinance in the coming year before HALA and the ADU legislation is passed? And if not, would you consider a moratorium on cutting down the last 6,000 exceptional trees in our city?
Thank you, Jessica. I've been working with some of the advocates that are trying to advance legislation to put more protection for trees in. And we have an urban forestry commission at the city of Seattle too, and they've been providing a lot of guidance for that. I have committed to them to work with them on legislation, and I made clear the components of that legislation that I would like to see, including protection for the exceptional trees, and including a permitting path for trees over 6 inches in diameter that require permits for removal of those trees. We had legislation that had gone through a SEPA analysis this fall, and the hope was to get that passed in time. A lot of the advocates did not like that legislation, understand the right to that, and so they challenged it. And so we withdrew that legislation. And so the timeline for this is probably not going to happen before MHA gets passed. There's ongoing work to be done on figuring out what is legislation. Any piece of legislation around land, not any piece, most land use legislation we put forward goes through a SEPA analysis, and the city decides through that analysis if it would require an environmental impact statement or not. And oftentimes we decide it doesn't, and that's a determination of non-significance, a DNS. And that determination itself is challengeable. And so no matter how adequate that is, anyone who knows the process or has enough money to file the challenge, it's not very expensive, can do that, and essentially delays the process for 3 to 6 months until a hearing examiner hears it. There's no merit base, it's not like you can, no, that was a really good DNS, and there's no way you can challenge it. Anyone can step forward and challenge it. I'm working on it, I've been working on this for a number of years to impose transportation impact fees on new development, and that legislation got challenged, and so that got delayed till next year. That was not a group of neighborhood activists, that was a group of developers or land use attorneys that challenged that. So again, they're not going to win it. They have the right to do this, but they can delay it 6 months. And so with the tree stuff, you know, we're hoping to get to a place, and you know, in my discussion with the tree advocates, there were some people that really wanted that legislation to move forward, but all it takes was one person willing to challenge it and not withdraw it, and we were stuck. And so instead of delaying the process 6 months on that legislation that we were going to change anyways because it needed some changes, we said we'll just withdraw it and go back to the drawing board. That legislation is slated to go through Councilmember Johnson's committee. And so I've been working with the tree advocates, and I think there's a path there. I've been working with Councilmember Johnson. I think we're pretty aligned, although I think there's a lack of trust between communities, and that's causing some breakdowns, and there's a lot of other things happening in the city too. So I don't think it'll be passed before MHA does, if that happens at the end of March. It's possible that it could happen by the time the backyard cottage legislation happens. I don't know the legality of a moratorium on exceptional trees relative to what's in place, so we'd have to talk a little more about that. But the concept, I certainly would like to preserve trees, and I've had occasions to work closely with neighbors to preserve a tree. It's amazing how much effort we can put in to save one tree, but for some neighborhoods that means a lot, and it's great when you see them there. So. Yeah. I wanted, just one thing I forgot to mention. The Mandatory Housing Affordability is going to go through the Planning, Land Use, and Zoning Committee, which is Councilmember Johnson's committee. The backyard cottage and basement units is going to go through my committee, which is the Sustainability and Transportation Committee. That's probably not what one would expect, but it's legislation that I've been working on since I was chair of the Land Use Committee. And Councilmember Johnson has plenty of work in his committee, so he's happy to hand it off to me. So if you care a ton about land use issues and you're signed up for the Land Use Committee, email alerts, you may want to sign up for the Sustainability and Transportation Committee too, to make sure you get the alerts on when we're having those committee meetings too.
Okay, thanks. Next, we're going to move on to a question on the soda tax from Jim Harris. Microphone, Joe.
Well, the soda tax raised a lot more money than was expected. And one of the council members was trying to find some way to spend that money. Anybody speak out in favor of any of Okay. The soda tax raised a lot more money than was expected. And at least one of the city council members was quoted to say they got to find some way to spend that money. Anybody speak out in favor of giving it back to the taxpayers or reducing the tax?
So the soda tax, well, there's 9 council members and a mayor, so we may have had all different reasons for it. But for me, the reason I supported the soda tax is for public health reasons. We know that soda is unhealthy for you. We know it leads to chronic diseases, things like diabetes, obesity, heart disease. I'll get to it. And so what we hear from our public health experts, including King County Public Health, University of Washington's Public Health, School of Public Health, is that we need to change behavior. And one way you can change behavior is tax policy. And so this is obviously a tool that's been used around the country to increase the cost of sugary beverages for people. It's similar to what we do with alcohol and what we do with cigarettes. But here's the problem with the soda tax, and it's probably not distinct from the other ones, but we know that low-income communities and communities of color disproportionately consume pop. That's for a variety of reasons. One, we know that the big soda players market to them in a way, as they market to all of our youth to sell that stuff. We also know a lot of those folks, a lot of lower income folks live in communities that don't have access to healthy foods. They don't have grocery stores that they can walk to or easily take a bus to. Instead, they have convenience stores and corner stores that make their profit. And these aren't bad people that are running the corner store, but they make their profit on high margin soda pop. And so the people in those communities consume more than I do for sure. And so imposing a tax on those communities to get them to change behavior and then saying, I want to use that money to go fix potholes somewhere else, for me, doesn't feel right. If we have a pothole problem, let's figure out a fair tax to raise. But what I heard from public health experts, including people from low-income communities and communities of color who are public health experts in those communities is we need help. Our people are dying and getting sick at disproportionate rates, and we need you to help us. And we think a tax is the right thing as long as you invest the revenue from that tax back in our communities. So, yeah, make it harder for us to buy pot. But invest so those people have alternatives for them, so that their kids can get healthy beverages, that they can get healthy food, that the schools they go to have water fountains that serve clean water, that they have water bottles and things so they can drink water as opposed to pop. And so when I saw that the revenues were coming in higher, I thought, oh, bummer. This means people are consuming a lot more pop than we thought. The health problem we have is bigger than we thought. So what we need to be doing is investing more in those communities than I originally thought. The mayor did some shuffling of money in the budget, which you probably heard a number of council members were not happy with. And we're trying to put things in place so that that cannot happen in future years, so that that money continues to go back. But the amount was set, not because we want to raise $15 million. It was, what's the amount we can set that we think will have the public health impact that we want to see?
Okay, thanks. Let's see.
Well, we're studying it for sure to see the benefits it has.
We're going to move on.
Well, we don't know. We didn't have a good baseline for what the baseline is, but we had a preliminary report about 3 months ago in committee on what the consumption is now, or was last year, and we'll be looking next year at what the consumption is to see if it worked. Because you're right, if it turns out people are over-consuming, then you're right. That will not have worked. Sorry, Tom.
That's all right, thanks. Let's see, next we've got a question on transit to Ballard. Katie? Victor?
I see when people stand up, like 3 people with mics, kind of, it's kind of threatening. You okay, Katie?
My question is about ST3 and the light rail coming to Ballard, and it's also about how terrible it is to ride your bike over the Ballard Bridge. And I'm wondering if, thank you. I'm wondering if there is a way, or if there has been conversation around including a bike lane in wherever this transit line is that comes into Ballard.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I'm going to start with the Ballard Bridge, which is really an awful facility for both bikes and pedestrians. It was built in a different era, and the design standards were different. We've been able to do some retrofitting on some of the bridges to make them safer. We've done some minor things around Ballard Bridge, the things in the kind of $100,000 range that have actually made some improvements. But as someone who occasionally bikes across that bridge, but really tries to avoid it as much as I can, there's still a lot of work to do. In this year's budget, we did use a tool called a proviso to basically make sure that this next chunk of money will be spent on improving the interchange on the southwest corner of Ballard Bridge, so where it intersects with Nickerson. There's some design work, we're talking, I think, like $500,000 to do some work there, which will help make it safer. But the big investment is maybe shifting the barrier a little bit and putting a railing in, and that's millions of dollars. That is currently not in the budget. And then if you want to go even bigger, it's widening and expanding, and it becomes pretty challenging to do something really safe there. So to your question about can we use the Sound Transit investment as an opportunity to expand our bike capacity is something we've definitely been exploring. I don't think that that's likely what's going to happen, because I think my hope, at least, of the alignment that Sound Transit picks, it won't be feasible. But SDOT and Sound Transit have had conversations. The other piece of the conversation is how much longer is the Ballard Bridge going to be a functional bridge for even current capacity, and when will it need to be replaced? And so there's a bridge feasibility study or seismic study, a bridge study, I'll leave it at that we expect to hear back on first or second quarter next year that will give us some more clarity about the timing of the replacement for the Ballard Bridge.
Just Ballard Bridge?
What's that?
Is that just Ballard Bridge or other bridges?
No, we're studying a handful of bridges. The Ballard Bridge is the one that I'm most focused on. I think there's 6 bridges in that study, if I recall correctly. And so the long-term trajectory of the Ballard Bridge is an open question. And if Sound Transit is building a similar height bridge. There was originally talk about why doesn't Sound Transit or an SDOT partner up, build a temporary bridge for cars that we run on, then tear down the Ballard Bridge, rebuild the Ballard Bridge for cars, and then the temporary bridge that was built for cars can be converted to light rail, and somewhere in the combination of those we get better pedestrian and bike connections. That adds a layer of complexity to Sound Transit's project, and I think SDOT is not in a position ready to do that. So I don't think that's going to happen, but it's been vetted. If Sound Transit has a bridge, a low bridge like the Ballard Bridge, there would be a possibility for figuring out how SDOT or the city could pay a little extra money to widen it and have that be bike and ped friendly, and I think that we would want to explore that. I think it's unlikely, I hope it's unlikely that Sound Transit is going to build a low bridge for a variety of reasons. The big one being that biking here today, I went across the Fremont Bridge and that thing was open for about 10 minutes. And you can only imagine the person in Tacoma waiting for their light rail train that's stuck in Ballard for 10 minutes while the bridge is open. It's a problem. They're talking about building a much higher bridge that either have no openings or very few openings, but that becomes a grade problem for pedestrians and bikes at some point. And you'd have to bike up to Crown Hill to get on the bridge to go over at some point. So I'm not sure that works. And the real preferred alternative in the work we've done, I've been part of this a little bit, with community members is a tunnel. And so that is going to be studied in the environmental impact statement that they do. And my sense from the community is there's a tunnel design that meets a lot of the needs of the community. It's more expensive, and so we have work to do there. It's not a sure thing by any stretch of the imagination, but that's where a lot of the energy is, and I don't think you would put bike or ped facilities in the tunnel. And so, which means we still need to solve it. It's a problem. And as I said, we have some short-term things that'll make it slightly better. We're probably directing a lot of folks to head over the Fremont Bridge, which is a better facility. If you're going downtown to South Lake Union, that's probably a better route anyways, but if you're trying to go to Queen Anne or Inner Bay or to the new Expedia, you don't want to go across the Fremont Bridge, you're going to want to go across the Ballard Bridge. And we've also had conversations, or there's been suggestions to have more conversations with the Army Corps of Engineers and the locks. That's not a fast route because it's a walking route, but leaving that open for longer hours a little bit to allow that connection out. It's a beautiful route if you have time. So thanks for your question, and it's a problem that we're trying to stay focused on.
Thanks. Let's see, Karen Youngberg had a question on something on density and infrastructure.
My question is regarding density. If we're working with the school district and the police department, for instance, I live in where the elementary school already has almost 550 students, and there isn't room for portables, and then they're increasing density. Where are the kids going to go? Additionally, from my house, you can walk to 20 different places where you can buy liquor within a mile. We have one police station that serves the north end. There's 4 in the rest of the city, and every day practically somebody gets their house broken into, their car broken into. We need to get a new car, but I'm afraid to get a new car because we can't afford to handle, the theft. And also traffic improvements. We have so much more traffic, but there hasn't been any, except for 15th. I like the crosswalk on 15th. That's great. But we need more marked intersections and more lights, because a lot of people don't realize that any intersection is a legal intersection. And they just zoom through. As you can see, I have crutches. I can't cross the fucking street, sorry, but because people, when they see me, they speed up, and it's scary. And you combine that with everybody, going to the pubs or the breweries or whatever, and they don't even, in our weather, they don't see. So also, that's another thing. The LED lights, street lights, they're bad. The AMA has come out against them because they cause so much glare, people can't see. I realize we just put them in, and we're still putting them in other parts of the city, but we should perhaps look at what we can do to improve that.
thank you for the comments, and, you know, everyone in our city should feel safe at whatever mode they want to get around, and, you know, it's not right that you don't feel safe crossing streets, and we have some work to do. The city's made a commitment to kind of an international effort called Vision Zero, which is to completely eliminate all traffic deaths and serious injuries by the year 2030. We've seen the numbers for 2017 just came out, and I think there were 2 bike deaths. I forget the number of pedestrian deaths last year. But it wasn't 0. And the number of serious injuries was, I think, in the triple digits. So we have work to do. Now, I will say, by any statistical measure, the city of Seattle is one of the safest cities, not just in the country, but in the world. I mean, we compare to some of the Scandinavian countries as far as our safety. But that doesn't mean that anyone in the city feels like it's good enough. We don't have great models to look at around the country, because frankly, most people are doing worse than us. But we are trying to figure out and be innovative about how can we continue to make improvements. One of the things is investments. So we have a pedestrian master plan that lays out an ambitious goal, but a vision for what the city should look like for pedestrians. The challenge around that is that the current funding levels, we're going to complete the pedestrian master plan in somewhere between 300 and 400 years. I mean, it's funny, right? Until someone gets hurt and killed, it's like it's embarrassing. It's expensive, the investments we need to make. We, as I mentioned earlier, been trying to impose transportation impact fees for a number of years. The City Council started that work probably 4 or 5 years ago and funded the research to be done, because there's the state requirement around the data analysis that has to be done. It's pretty significant, and handed it off to Mayor Murray, and then he stopped work on that for about 1.5 years. And at the end of his term, last year's budget, the City Council took that money out of the budget and did the unusual step of putting it in the City Council's budget, and so the City Council will now complete the work on the transportation impact fee studies. The first step in that, to implement a transportation impact fee, is to have a project list. And we've largely taken the pedestrian master plan, along with some other project lists, to be the set of projects we want to invest in from transportation impact fees. We need to put that list in our comprehensive plan, and that was the thing I mentioned was supposed to happen last week, but because of the challenge to the determination of non-significance by some developers, we're not going to be able to do that until next year. Once it's in the comprehensive plan, we can move forward with actually imposing a transportation impact fee. And my hope is that we can do that sometime in the first half of next year. And it has the potential to raise hundreds of millions of dollars over a decade. And those are projects, can be invested in projects like more pedestrian safety projects. And there is a bit of, the more resources we have, the more we can do. And a question of fairness about who should be paying for it, and I do believe that new development should pay for some of that. You also asked about schools. We are planning to simultaneously do an impact fee on schools. Similarly, there needs to be a project list for schools, and thankfully the school district, because of the levy that you're going to all get a chance to vote on in February, has a project list that is much bigger than the levy we'll be voting on. And so we can use that project list to also have impact fees for schools. Now, that requires a level of coordination, which we should be able to do, but it's a little more complex because it's city raising the money and the school spending it. It's also, these are impact fees, and state law is very clear that you get to mitigate impacts. And so for schools, we're mitigating housing that's being built for school-age kids. The vast majority of new housing in our city is studios and 1-bedrooms, and it's not for school-age kids. And so we're going to have a challenge charging school impact fees on that type of construction. Doesn't mean we can't do it. It's just going to be somewhat limited in our ability to significantly solve some of the school challenges we have around a school impact fee. So those are 2 areas. You also mentioned police. There isn't a police impact fee, but obviously that's something we need to continue to fund through our general fund taxes. And the issue around how do we cover a large and growing North Seattle is a really good question. I did not support the scale, the $160 million for a new precinct last time, but I do believe that the facility we have is not adequate. And we're waiting for this mayor to come forward with a plan for how she plans to address that police. It wasn't in this budget, but now that maybe the police union contract is behind us, although I'm not sure that it's behind us, that'll be an area that she could focus on and make a proposal that we could start debating.
Okay, thanks. Next, we have a question on the Ballard Commons. Angie, is that you?
Hi there. So yeah, I know that your office gets a lot of questions about public safety, and I just wanted to ask one around Ballard Commons in particular, and you can relate it out to other questions that you're probably receiving. And that area of Ballard has had many different services added, tons of growth and density added. And I'm curious how, if City Council kind of loops back to see what were neighborhood questions and concerns from 3 years ago, 5 years ago, at different points in time, when things were added and changed in the neighborhood, and then later on we have public safety issues. Are there those discussions that go back and look at, say, hearing examiner, findings, or different, meetings and things that have happened? One example that I'll give you is that in the recent budget, Lorena Gonzalez included $260,000 for 2 full-time park ambassadors to program, Activate the Park, which is great. And they've been doing some of that this year through the Parks Department. They had a cute little trailer that came through recently and had a kind of consulting for artists and entrepreneurs. And on the final night that the trailer was at Ballard Commons, I understand their tires were slashed, and I think they had to cancel their final. They went to several parks in Seattle, and I don't think they were able to continue on to Lake City. And afterward, the fellow who runs that program, he says, he posted on Facebook later, and this is a well-traveled, world-wise person. Yep, it was a real eye-opener in Seattle. I've been to 42 states with this project and never had a situation where we were literally surrounded by car campers. We felt unsafe and had to cancel the last dates. Very sad to see this situation in Seattle. The park should be a place of peace and curiosity, but it was not safe and we canceled for the first time ever. And then they are coming back for another project around the viaduct, which is great. And he says this next stop in Seattle has much more security, so we're excited. But we don't have much more security in the neighborhood. And so I just was curious again to have you kind of speak to this current funding that appeared in the budget and then just public safety issues in general. How is the council talking about all the growth and change and all these different influences and planning around that?
So in addition to the addition of the Parks Ambassadors, we also funded in the budget funding for business improvement areas to support them in hiring outreach workers. And so the Ballard Alliance is contracted with REACH to have an outreach worker. She's been very successful and well received, and the city's trying to relieve the Ballard Alliance of that burden and provide some additional funding, and for other neighborhoods, the International District and the University District too, to have those types of outreach workers. Your first part of the question, Angie, was about what do we hear when we cite facilities that serve homeless, and we hear the same thing every time we do it. We have, since long before I was on council, is people's fear that it will attract types of behavior and the types of clients that those facilities will draw will hurt the neighborhood. I don't know that we've done a thorough study, but I can tell you every time since I've been on council we've done anything, those are some of the comments we get. And we know, as from earlier questions, that the homeless problem is growing, not just in Ballard, but around the community. I live in Fremont, there's a relatively large encampment that's growing near the Troll. There aren't really a lot of services around there. Folks just are looking for places to be. I think one of the challenges we have that we have not addressed is putting some order to where folks who are sleeping outdoors, when we have 4,000 people and about half of them are in vehicles and half are not, where do we want them to be? Obviously the answer is we want them in housing.
Safety though, about people who commit crimes, not people sleeping outdoors. Exactly.
Yeah.
Differentiate.
And so, let me finish on that and I'll get to that one. We have made a series of policy decisions at the city, some of which I don't agree with, that have significantly limited certain places where folks historically have gone when they've been without shelter. Under the last administration, They swept 500 to 600 people out from under I-5. Now, the conditions under there were horrific, and letting them be as they were was not an acceptable solution. But simply moving 500 or 600 people out from there without adequate housing options for them to go into meant that those people ended up in other neighborhoods and other parks. I look at Ballard, under this administration, you know, was perpetual encampments under the Ballard Bridge along Leary. And I know that that's a problem for folks there, and I know people should be in housing, not on a bridge, but we put a fence around that. So that is now off limits, and those people didn't get housing when it was fenced. And so they show up somewhere else. We haven't fenced off Ballard Commons Park, and so we haven't fenced off Trolls Knoll, and so folks go somewhere. You know, I've been talking with the navigation team who's been working with the population both at the Ballard Commons Park and at, near the Troll in Fremont, and they, you know, they're like, there are 50 people here. We don't have anywhere to sweep them to right now. We don't have housing to offer them. We're doing outreach with them. We're finding opportunities with them. We have our LEAD program. We're doing referrals to them to try to get them into the services they need. But right now, if you told us that, you know, if I don't direct the navigation team, but if the mayor said, tomorrow morning I need everyone out of there, it would take 3 days to notice and all that stuff, like those 50 people would end up in some other neighborhood. And you know, that is the game we've been playing, is chasing folks around. Now to the crime, that type of crime is, property crime is not acceptable anywhere. And we need to make sure that the police have the resources to do that. I heard from the police department around Trolls Knoll that they had arrested a couple people for burglaries in progress. I don't actually know if those were people that were living in encampments or just other people. That wasn't clear to me, but you know, the concern about crime and the anecdotes about crime that come up and the data about crime is real. You know, it's growing in a lot of places in the city, and we need to make sure we have the resources to address that. And it's challenging. And this, you know, if the reality is every year more and more people are entering into homelessness, and some of that is crime comes with that to some extent. I mean, I'm not going to say that data is totally linked, but I know that's the perception for sure. You know, we need to provide more affordable housing. We need to have more police. We have more poverty in our city. Our system's broken, and it's you know, the path out of this is not simply just doing the same thing, but more of it. We got to figure out how we fix the system. And as I mentioned to an earlier question, I think some of the structural changes are what need to happen to make some meaningful changes.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, I think we've got time for one, maybe two more questions. Jen Adams. Jen, where are you, back there? You had a question on outreach.
What are we doing about vehicle residency?
It's a very succinct question, Jan. Thank you. In this year's budget, there was about $250,000 to once again try a safe parking program. The mayor has been working on what this program looks like. I haven't had a lot of insight into the mayor's work, although she did allow my staff member, or the department allowed my staff member to be part of some of the most recent reviews in the last week, and so I believe they're close to selecting a provider, service provider that will manage the site. I don't know where the site will be yet. It's possible that the mayor knows, but I don't know. But we have a couple thousand people living in vehicles, and a small program with a lot is going to be a small program that's not going to significantly reduce 4,000 people out there. You know, Jen, you know this is an area that's been a particular focus of mine, and it's been a frustration that through multiple administrations have not been able to get the type and scale of solution that we want to see. One of the things that I've learned as a council member is that I'm a council member. I'm not the mayor, and I get to put things in the budget, and I can set policies, but I don't run the 11,000 city employees that work. I don't tell them what to do. When I put money in the budget, I put it in a bucket that says something like, to work with vehicular residency. And it's, you know, we can put some language in there to try to get so specific, and sometimes we get really specific. but the mayor has a lot of flexibility and authority. And I was grateful to see this mayor in her first budget put $250,000, not that that comes anywhere near meeting the need, but I hope that that's a signal that this mayor, unlike previous mayors, is actually going to take some ownership of this problem. I mean, the data we see year after year, and we're a month out from the next one night count or point in time count. But if the trends continue, we'll continue to see a growing portion of the homeless population living in vehicles, and that would be consistent with what I've seen through the course of this year and last year. We need to have a scalable program. So I don't have great answers. I can tell you really quickly that if I were mayor, the types of things I would do. One, we would need to figure out how to identify individuals living in vehicles. There's a lot of talk about, identifying who are the folks that are, running a math lab in the vehicle versus someone that just lost their housing and took their last $2 and bought an RV and is trying to stay out of shelter. We can do that work to discern between those people. We can set up programs to work with people. And the folks that are doing stuff, even the behavior we don't like, using heroin on a regular basis, they're still our citizens, and we need a different program to work with them. We can't simply ignore them and let them die. But they need to be part of our society, and there's rules they need to follow, and we need to work with them and give them the tools to get out of addiction. And there's a bunch of people out there that aren't addicted and don't have mental health issues. They're just really poor. And we need to give them a safe place to be and move them on out. And our outreach workers and our LEAD folks, so LEAD is I've used that acronym a couple times today, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. It's a program that just came to North Seattle about 6 months ago. It started in Belltown and downtown Seattle probably about 5 or 6 years ago. When we expanded to North Seattle, we asked them, really strongly urged them, to not just work with folks that are initially programs focused on low-level drug and prostitution offenses, and said, will you also work with the population living in vehicles? And they said, we're not sure that's a good fit, but we'll try. And what we heard after they've been doing it for 2 or 3 months is like, this is actually a really good fit. And in fact, the police department, the North Precinct, has been giving them referrals at a huge rate because the police officers really see LEAD as a program. It's like sticking this person in jail right now is not going to solve anybody's problem. Some people, you absolutely need to do that, right? If you catch someone slashing the tires at the vehicle, it's like that is not okay behavior and something that need to be held accountable. But folks that are living with some sort of chronic conditions that may be technically breaking the law, but we know that's not a solution. And the police in the North Precinct have overwhelmed the system, frankly, in getting the trainings to make those referrals. And within about 3 months, they've largely filled up a year's worth of referral capacity for LEAD. We added some additional resources in this budget, about $500,000, which will both help North Precinct add some more caseworkers in LEAD and also expand LEAD to the Southeast and Southwest precincts, so it'll have a footprint in all of Seattle. So those are 2 things that we're doing. But Jen, I'm a little ways away from standing here and telling you and an audience full of people that in 6 months or 12 months you can expect to see hundreds or thousands fewer people living in vehicles in the next year. We haven't quite seen that commitment yet, but I hope it's around the corner.
Okay, I got one quick question on a topic that hasn't been covered, and I know it's something dear to your heart, the missing link. Can you tell us what's happening? Quickly.
Yeah, so there's about a little under 2 miles left that is missing. That project has been broken down into 2 segments. I don't know the exact mileage, but it's about 50-50. One goes from the intersection of 24th and Market to the locks, and the other goes from that point east towards Fred Meyer. The portion in front of the Nordic Museum here went out to bid about a month ago. I believe, I'm not positive, either we're still receiving bids or we received the bids. I haven't heard that we picked someone, but construction on that should start relatively soon. Exciting. Now, that still leaves a missing link, and the most controversial part, of course, is the part that's yet to come. That's the alignment along Shill Shoal. There was a hearing in front of a King County judge on Friday. My understanding is that sometime tomorrow, that judge will issue, I'm not sure if it's a he or she, their ruling. And at that point, we'll have some clarity. If the judge rules in the city's favor, my understanding is that the mayor and her team is prepared to move forward swiftly with finalizing design work and getting that out to bid. But I don't speak for the mayor. I've been asking questions about this on a weekly basis for the last year, and that's my understanding, so I hope that's the case. I imagine, the lawyers have been, keeping busy for over a decade now, and I imagine they won't stop after tomorrow. I'm sure they'll find another venue to sue in. But I believe we can move forward with construction, and my hope is that's what the mayor does. Now, the ruling could be adverse and tells us we have to do some other stuff, and we'll have to respond at that point.
All right, well, I want to thank Mike for coming out tonight. And quick announcement, our next meeting of the District Council is January 9th. We meet the second Wednesday of the month. We'll be meeting back in the Sunset Hill Community Association building on 66th, I believe, and 30th Northwest. You're all invited. We'll be posting an agenda in the next couple of weeks for that. I want to thank Eric again for allowing us to use this great space. If you're not a member of the museum, you should do so. It's a great asset for the community. Oh, and Mike brought a couple of handouts. There's two different ones. Four handouts. Not copies for everybody, so if you could share one, that'd be